Hey everybody, welcome back to When Harry Met Board Games. Today we have another top 10 list for you all. Today I'm going to be sharing with you guys my top 10 classic board games. Now, here at When Harry Met Board Games, we appreciate games that have endured the test of time, and that's exactly what these 10 games are. These are games that, first of all, have been around for some while. Particularly for this video, I made the criteria at least 20 years. If the game had not been around for at least 20 years, then it will not qualify for this list. A second criteria is that it cannot just be age. This has to be a game of certain renown. This has to be a game that's still relevant, that has a cult following, that people talk about till this day. Because I do have lots of older games in my collection, but I wouldn't necessarily qualify many of those as classics. Lots of these are obscure games that many people don't know about. But these games, these 10, are far from being obscure. So those are the two criteria. At least 20 years in publication. Some of these games might actually be out of print, but at least 20 years from its original publishing. And the second criteria, a game that still has that same relevance among particular pockets, at least in the board game community. So without any further ado, let's get straight to the list. So before we get to the list proper, I actually do have one honorable mention, a number 11, if you will. And that game here is Talisman. And this game here, lots of people have despised this game because it is a roll and move game. However, this is a classic from yesteryear. This game came out originally in 1983. And you've got to understand that back then, most board games, at least in North America, were roll and move games. It was a very popular mechanism. So this game does have that. There is an element of choice because the board has several tracks, an outer track, a middle track, and an inner track that your characters are going to be moving around. And whenever you roll one die, you only roll one die, you have to move in either direction. Now this game here, I play with lots of house rules to modify it to shorten the game length because this game can be long and to give the players a little bit more sense of control. But other than that, I love the fantasy theme that's going on here. I love the different encounter cards that players are flipping over whenever they land on particular locations, resolving it. Some of these are terrible events. Some of them are NPCs that players get to interact with. Some of these are monsters, bad guys that players have to fight. Really cool from that perspective, just the timeless nature of this game. It's a fun experience. Definitely beer and pretzels. Do not take it too seriously. And definitely house rule it. My number 11, honorable mention for this particular list, classic board games, and it does qualify, and that is Talisman. And now we will move to the list proper. My number 10, classic board game, also from the 1980s, also fantasy themed, and that is DungeonQuest. And this game here was originally published by Games Workshop, I believe in the late 80s, 1987. And this is a dungeon crawl, literally a dungeon crawl, where players are competitively trying to be the player that collects the most loot and makes it back out of the dungeon in order to survive and qualify for that victory. And basically, this game is a tile laying game where players are flipping over tiles as they progress through the dungeon, and that tile will be placed right then and there, and it will connect to a previously placed tile, creating or elongating the current path. And there's different things. There's corridors that allow players to move an additional time for that turn. There's different types of dungeon rooms that allow players to search, to perhaps enter the crypts. There's other dungeon rooms that actually present some sort of trap for the players. Each dungeon room it requires for a player to draw and reveal the top dungeon card, which will tell you what you find in that dungeon room. And sometimes you'll find nothing. Sometimes you'll find treasure. Sometimes you'll find an item. Sometimes you'll find an enemy. You'll find somebody you have to compete and combat against. And this game here, very brutal, lots of things that happen to you that make you suffer life. I do play with a variant, an official variant, at least for this third edition from Fantasy Flight here, which is when a player is knocked out, when they have suffered their maximum amount of hit points. Instead of them being eliminated from the game, which is the original rule, they recover half of their life and they lose half of their loot, or they discard one or a couple of their loot cards. So it does set them back, but it doesn't necessarily keep them out of contention from the game. But this game, again, just like Talisman, fun, immersive experience. Do not take it too seriously from a competitive perspective, because there is lots of luck between the different cards that you run through and the tiles that you draw. Lots of it is very luck based, but I enjoy the tile lane. I enjoy the asymmetry between the different characters, and I enjoy the suspense as you draw those cards or draw those tiles, waiting to see what's going to happen and what's on the other side. Really cool. My number 10 classic board game, DungeonQuest. Now we move on to my number 8 classic board game, another game from the 1980s, another Games Workshop original publication, this one in tandem with Hasbro, and that is HeroQuest. Or in this case, this is Milton Bradley, the original. The recent Kickstarter was from Hasbro. And HeroQuest here, as it says here, HeroQuest game system, is basically the first dungeon crawl board game, the first attempt of players to, or designers and publishers, to take the concept of an RPG, take the concept of a Dungeons and Dragons, and you will, and make it, compartmentalize it in order for it to accommodate a board game setting. And that's exactly what HeroQuest does. Now, HeroQuest is very simplistic, very basic, but at the same time, it is the inspiration for most dungeon crawlers today. To some extent, games today, even if they're not directly impacted by HeroQuest, they are impacted by other dungeon crawlers that were. And basically, on a player's turn, on a character's turn, this is a 4-hero dungeon crawler. You have to have 4 heroes, no matter how many players there are. And it's a cooperative game. They're all working to accomplish the quest. And you get 2 actions. You get a movement, and you get some other action, which typically is attacking. This is a 1 versus all. One player takes on the role of Zargon, or the Dungeon Master, the Overlord, the bad guy, controlling all the enemies and all the decisions from that side of the game. And then the other player or group of players control the 4 heroes, as I mentioned earlier. Really cool, really neat, fun game as the dungeon reveals itself as you explore. You do not know what's inside of rooms until you enter rooms. You do not know what's at the end of a corridor until you're actually looking that way. So all of these things are really cool. It makes the heroes really vulnerable. The heroes don't know what's at the turn of a corner. The heroes don't know if it's a good decision to go into that room or not. Does that room contribute towards the outcome of the quest, or is that room just a distraction, just an obstacle, just a setback, something to consider? And the role of the Zargon player here is really just that of a DM, not necessarily to destroy and annihilate the heroes, but to give them a little bit of a challenge and basically control the game. Really cool. If you want to transition from a RPG background to a board game atmosphere, then HeroQuest is a cool game to do for that. And that's my number 8 classic board game, or my number 9 classic board game of all time, HeroQuest. And now we move on to my number 8 classic board game. And this game here just barely kind of met the criteria of age. It's been around for 22 years now. And that is Lord of the Rings, designed by Reiner Knizia. And some people might say, is this game a classic? I think the fact that just recently, about a year ago, they released the 20th anniversary edition, Fantasy Flight did, I think that establishes this game as a classic. It had enough demand for people to actually make, or for Fantasy Flight to decide to make that. And this here takes a very popular J.R.R. Tolkien, Middle-earth, Lord of the Rings universe, and makes the first cooperative game. This game is an innovator. All games like Pandemic, games like Gloomhaven, games like Shadows over Camelot, Battlestar Galactica. These games owe their existence to games like Lord of the Rings, because this initiated this cooperative genre. And players are taking on the role of different hobbits with different abilities, and basically they're going through different adventures represented by different boards. There are 4 or 2 double-sided boards representing 4 main adventures that the players are trying to progress and advance to, ultimately trying to get to Mordor, to Mount Doom, to destroy the One Ring. However, throughout the course of the game, players are taking actions that make them suffer. It makes them suffer corruption. And all the while, you have this corruption track, and Sauron starts on one end of the track, and the hobbits start on the other end of the track. And Sauron is going to be progressing towards the left, and the heroes, the hobbits, as they accrue corruption, they're going to be progressing towards the right. And if they ever overlap with Sauron here, then that player, that hero, that hobbit will be eliminated from the game. Now, if that hobbit happens to be the current ring bearer, then all players have lost. So that's another thing that players are trying to manage. Who will be the ring bearer? And there are ways incorporated into the gameplay for players to kind of determine who will walk out at the end of a round being the ring bearer. I think this game is cool, very simplistic, but if you like the Lord of the Rings universe, then this game can be enjoyable. My number 8 classic board game of all time, The Lord of the Rings. Now we move on to my number 7 classic board game, and just like number 8, this is a Reiner Knizia design that also came out in the year 2000, so we're talking about 22 years, and also just recently had a reprint. However, unfortunately, it was not from a North American distributor, and that is Hollywood Golden Age. As a matter of fact, I just had someone message me on Instagram asking me if I could sell them this game. And I'm sorry, I don't know your name. You said you watched my video. I accidentally lost your message before I got to reply. I can't part with this. I really enjoy it. And again, it's not easily available, at least not this edition here, the Hollywood Golden Age edition. This was published by Luda Nova, which is a Spain-based publisher. And I believe it had a reprint in France as well. And this game, basically, players are taking on the role of Hollywood producers. In this context here, we're talking about the Golden Age, 1940s, 1950s. So you got lots of these black and white actors, and some of them you might have heard of. You got all these famous directors from back then as well. And players are basically partaking in lots of different little bids, auctions throughout the course of the game, trying to use these bids in order to win over directors, win over cameramen, win over actors, seamstresses, everything you think you would need in order to make a particular film. And all the films are real films that actually came out back in the day. And you're trying to fill all of these slots and try to have the most valuable movies as possible so you can win awards, Academy Awards. And these awards are going to give you points at the end of the game. You're also going to win an award if you actually happen to have the worst movie in the entire game. That actually wins you an award as well. Really fun. I feel that it's very thematic. Endures the test of time, at least in some parts of the world. My number 7 classic board game of all time, Hollywood Golden Age. Now we move on to my number 6 classic board game. And this game here just barely made the cut. I think it's one of 2 games on my list that came out in 2002, so we're talking about 20 years, just barely. And I find that this game might be the most controversial as far as classic, although there are communities that I found that are playing this game till this day. And that is Prophecy by Vlaada Chvátil. And this game here had a reprint in the early 2010s, so it definitely still warranted that reprint back then. Not sure if it's been reprinted since. I do not believe so. I haven't found anything about that. But again, I still find communities on BGG that are playing this game. And this is Vlaada Chvátil's original fantasy adventure game before Mage Knight. And it's very different from Mage Knight. In this game, you just have your board straight up from the beginning of the game. This is very much in the vein of games like Roombound and games like Talisman that I mentioned earlier. This is definitely a descendant of those type of games. You have your board, which is your map, and you have all these different locations that players are going to go to. However, in this game, you're not rolling dice like in Talisman in order to move, or Roombound for that matter. Instead, players have a little bit more of control. Typically speaking, you could only move one space over to your left or to your right. However, there are resources that you can use. You have gold as a currency that you can use to spend for additional travel. Sometimes you could spend gold to move an additional space. Sometimes you could spend gold to move from one port location to another port location. If you find yourself in a magic portal, you can use gold in order to transport to another magic portal around the board. And players are taking their adventurers, their heroes, their characters, and they're basically leveling them up. You're accruing experience points, which you turn in order to buy these different guild cards that add additional skills and additional abilities to players. You're going to the village and you're going to the city to buy common items and rare items in the form of scrolls and spells and weapons, things that are going to strengthen your character, armor. Ultimately, you're going to these astral planes that are found in particular locations on the map, and you're going to defeat the guardians there, and ultimately after you defeat the guardians, you're going to collect the artifacts there. And players have to collect a certain amount of artifacts in order to win the game. This is a competitive game, race style, where you're trying to be the first player to accomplish the goal of getting these objective cards. But I find this game to be so enjoyable. There's so much different characters, 10 characters that come in the base game alone. This game does come with expansions, so many different items that you can collect, so many different ways you can go about leveling up and customizing your character, all these different enemies and NPCs that you can interact with throughout the course of the game. Very charming game, good enough to make it to my number 6 classic board game of all time, Prophecy. And now we move on to the top 5, the cream of the crop. My number 5 classic board game of all time is Puerto Rico. And just like Prophecy right before it, this game just barely made the cut. It came out in 2002, 22 years ago. And this game here was ranked on BGG #1 for a very long time. This game, very innovative with its variable phase order. The concept that each turn a player picks a role. They're going to get an action that they can do based on that role, but every other player on the table is going to get that same action. However, because they chose the role, they're going to get a additional bonus action, a bonus ability. So that's something to factor in. When do you choose roles? When is it best or most to your advantage? Because you do not want to do someone else's dirty work and pick ideally you don't want to pick a role or a character that's going to help someone around the table a lot more than it would help you. And basically, you're just planting different crops and you're producing them in your buildings, and you are shipping them to the motherland in order to gain victory points. And whoever has the most victory points at the end of the game is the winner of the game. There's a little bit of city building going on in the city of San Juan, which is a part of your player board. And those buildings are going to grant you special abilities that you could use throughout the course of the game. And they're also going to give you victory points at the end of the game. Classic board game. I don't think anybody would deny the fact that this game is a classic, whether they like it or not. My number 5 classic board game, Puerto Rico. And now we move on to my number 4. This game came out back in the year 2000. Former Spiel des Jahres winner, mainstream success. You find it in Target, you find it in Walmart, and that is Carcassonne, the tile laying game. And while there were games that had the tile laying element before it, this is the game that popularized it. In particular, the idea of expanding or creating your board as you go. This game also coined the phrase meeple. You had these wooden pieces shaped in the form of people. People went from mini people, and eventually the term meeple was born. And that's such a prevalent term nowadays in the board game industry. Really cool, very simple at its core. If you strip it to just its basic rules in the base game, this game can be taught to a child. However, once you start adding some of the expansions in cathedrals, for example, traders and builders, and these are expansions that I always play with, then you start to add additional meeples that could do different things, and then a certain level of nuance, a certain level of strategy and complexity is added to the game. And at the same time, it still retains its lightness. It still feels like a light, Zen-like experience. Really fun. I don't play too much original Carcassonne, vanilla Carcassonne. My favorite iterations nowadays are the castle and city, but I still from time to time go back to the original. My number 4 classic board game, Carcassonne. Now we move on to my number 3. And my number 3 classic board game is Arkham Horror. And this here is the 2nd edition. I'm distinguishing this from Arkham Horror 3rd Edition as a separate game. Arkham Horror 3rd Edition did come out a few years ago. As a matter of fact, it's right here. But at the same time, I'm qualifying this game for the list, even though this game technically was published in 2005, 17 years ago, which means it does not meet my 20-year criteria. However, I'm going to let this game slide due to its original publishing by Chaosium Incorporated back in the 1980s with Richard Launius and Sandy Peterson and a few other people involved in that original design. Based on that original 1st edition, I will include this here. Now, I will admit, I've never played the 1st edition. I've never even really watched a video of someone playing the 1st edition, which I probably should just for research purposes. But I'm going to qualify this game. This game is so much fun. This is a longer game. In many ways, it's outdated. But if you like these Cthulhu, Mythos, Arkham Horror File games, this is a game that you have to play at least once in your life. It is a longer game. It's the longest of all the Arkham Horror file games that I've played, and it takes quite a long time. I'd say it's at least a 3-hour investment, possibly more, and there can be some long turns, a little bit of waiting in between your turns if you play at the higher player counts. I prefer to play this game no more than 4 people, and sometimes I just play solo, controlling 2 or 3 characters, and I enjoyed that way too. But it's such a fun, immersive experience. It's different enough from games like Eldritch Horror and Arkham Horror 2nd Edition to warrant me playing it all on its own, and definitely to warrant it being on this list. So my number 3 classic board game, Arkham Horror 2nd Edition. Now we move on to the number 2, and my number 2 is a distant second to my number 1, but it's still a fun game. This game came out in 1995. Former Spiel des Jahres winner, and no, I am not talking about Catan. I am talking about El Grande, designed by Wolfgang Kramer and Richard Ulrich here. And this here is the big box by Z-Man. I believe this is currently out of print. I don't know if Z-Man still owns its rights, but this here, the big box edition, comes with 5 expansions. I've played 2 out of the 5 expansions, and I have enjoyed them. And basically, players, this is the grandfather to the area majority mechanism. Players are controlling their nobles and their knights in the provinces of Spain, and they're trying to have the majority, the control in all of these different areas. And if you have the majority in different areas, at the end of a scoring round, you'll score a certain amount of points. If you have secondaries, you'll score a certain amount of points. If you have tertiary, depending on the player count, you'll also be rewarded a few points as well. And basically, each round, players are partaking in a little bit of an auction for turn order. I always love it when games incorporate that, or incorporate some sort of fluid turn order process where it's not always the same, where it's not always, oh, just pass the turn order to the next player, or worse yet, the same player will be first for the rest of the game. I like when games have that dynamic turn order feature. Also, you're drafting these different action cards, and some of these action cards allow you to place lots of caballeros, lots of meeples on the board. Others don't give you that many meeples, but they might give you a really neat, cool action that could be very game-changing. Also, you're restricted as to where you can place these meeples, because you can never place the meeple where the king is, and you can only place meeples adjacent to regions, or to regions that are adjacent to the king. So the manipulation of that king piece in and of itself becomes a game within the game. Really neat, really fun, very streamlined. My number 2 classic board game of all time, El Grande. And now we move on to my number 1, the last game, the favorite classic game of all time. If you've been following this channel for some time, perhaps you might not be surprised, and that is Cosmic Encounter. And this here is the 2008 publication from from Fantasy Flight. But this game was originally published by Eon Games, I believe, back in 1977 or 1978. This game has been around for a long time, longer than I've been alive. And this is the science fiction, space-themed, alien-themed negotiating game par excellence. Players are engaging in diplomacy, they're engaging in combat, in warfare, and they're trying to get the most out of their particular alien race. There's tons of alien races, about 50 just in the base game alone, and there's 6 expansions. They just announced a new expansion coming out for 2022 that's even going to add campaign play to this game. That sounds really neat to me. I'm curious to see what that's going to look like. But for now, just the base game and the Cosmic Incursion expansion, which are the only 2 I've played, they have like 70 alien powers that you can choose from. So much variety, and each of these aliens do so many different things. So it's really about taking your alien power that was handed to you at the beginning of the game and getting the most out of it, knowing when you're going to be a powerhouse and just run over people. And in other cases, you're going to have to be much more diplomatic, much more humble and meek, and learn to navigate the political waters and find out who exactly around the table you want to align yourself with, who gives you the best chance of coming out on top, and endearing yourself to that player or that character and hoping that they take you under their wings. So many really cool things about this game. Every time I play this game, it is a memorable experience. This game plays from 3 to 5 players. I'm not a big fan of playing it at 3, but if you play it at 5 or 6, this game truly, truly shines. If you have not played Cosmic Encounter yet, at least one time in your life, do yourself a favor, find someone who owns a copy and play this game. My number 1 classic board game of all time. The fact that it's been around for over 40 years and it's getting an expansion in 2022 is proof of it. My number one classic game, Cosmic Encounter. And that's it for today's list, folks. Thank you so much for joining us here when Harry Met Board Games. Please comment down below. Tell me what you think about my particular 10 classic games. Comment a classic game or two that you really enjoy, and perhaps a classic game that you're surprised did not make it to my list. I'm interested in reading what you guys have to say. Well, guys, take care, and I'll catch you next time. This is Harry saying stay safe, stay healthy, and have fun gaming. Bye-bye.